The Postman Always Rings Twice wasn't just MGM's most uncomfortable hit, it was a $1,700,000 adaptation of a novel that had spent 12 years blocked from American cinema screens, produced by a studio whose chief executive hated it, directed by a recovering alcoholic who relapsed into a hotel room during filming, and built around a male lead whose heart was already failing. A man the government would spend the next 6 years trying to destroy before it finally succeeded. We are digging into the wreckage of The Postman Always Rings Twice, with 12 dark facts the studios kept locked away. Facts sealed inside Production Code Administration correspondence, Federal Bureau of Investigation surveillance files, HUAC testimony transcripts, and the leather-bound first edition a novelist pressed into an actress's hands as an apology for doubting her. James M. Cain published The Postman Always Rings Twice in February 1934. Within months, Columbia Pictures expressed interest in adapting it. Warner Brothers expressed interest. Both retreated when their legal and production departments ran the novel past the Breen office and received the same verdict. This material cannot be made into a film under the production code. The code's foundational requirements, that crime must be punished, that adultery must not be presented approvingly, that murder must carry consequences proportional to its gravity, were each individually violated by Cain's narrative, which presented a sexually ravenous working-class woman, a complicit drifter, and a murder that succeeds on its first attempt. MGM then purchased the rights and held them for 12 years without filming, keeping the title alive in the studio's library and off every screen, waiting for a cultural moment that would permit what the code had refused. That moment arrived in 1944 when Paramount's Double Indemnity, adapted from another Cain novel carrying the same moral transgressions, proved to Joseph Breen that the audience for sexually dangerous material was larger than his office's discomfort. MGM had owned The Postman Always Rings Twice for a decade and done nothing. Billy Wilder had broken the dam. MGM walked through the gap. But the real problem was that getting through the gap required 12 years of accumulated compromise, and the film that emerged carried every scar of that negotiation on its body. Louis B. Mayer ran MGM with an iron conviction about what American cinema should be: wholesome, aspirational, family-centered, morally legible. He had built the studio on Andy Hardy pictures, on musicals, on the proposition that entertainment was a form of optimism delivered in Technicolor. He hated The Postman Always Rings Twice. This is documented, not inferred, not implied, but recorded by the film's own production history. TCM's account of the production confirms that despite the film's enormous commercial success, Mayer, who always preferred more wholesome, family-oriented pictures, despised it. A studio head financing a film he despised about adultery and murder because the evidence of Double Indemnity's box office returns had made financial refusal impossible. That is the institutional condition under which The Postman Always Rings Twice was made. Every compromise in the finished film, every constraint on what the camera could show and what the script could say, was shaped by a man who would have been happier if it didn't exist. The film exists despite its producer. It is better for the resistance it was made against. This is exactly why Tay Garnett's direction feels simultaneously liberated and constrained, because it was both simultaneously in every scene. The most immediately striking visual decision in The Postman Always Rings Twice is Lana Turner's costuming. She wears white in nearly every scene, a palette so insistent it reads as a directorial statement before the film has established its narrative. It was not a directorial statement. It was a censorship strategy. Producer Carrie Wilson and director Tay Garnett devised the white wardrobe as a specific response to the Breen office's anxiety about Turner's role. As Garnett explained, there was a great problem of getting a story with that much sex past the censors. We figured that dressing Lana in white somehow made everything she did seem less sensuous. It was also attractive as hell, and it somehow took a little stigma off everything she did. The Production Code Administration reviewed every page of every script draft and every still photograph taken on the set. The white wardrobe is the visual record of that review, a chromatic argument directed not at the audience but at the censor. Cora Smith, in white, reads as innocence. Cora Smith, in Cain's novel, is something considerably darker. The wardrobe is the distance between those two things, measured in fabric. But the real problem was that the white wardrobe, for all its calculated innocence, was also the most effective piece of sexual signaling in the film, which means Garnett and Wilson had simultaneously satisfied the censors and defeated their own argument. The Postman Always Rings Twice is the third film adaptation of Cain's novel, not the second and not the first. Le Dernier Tournant, a French adaptation directed by Pierre Chenal, was released in 1939. Ossessione, directed by Luchino Visconti, was released in Italy in 1943. Neither film was legally authorized by Cain or the studio that held his American rights. Both were made without license, in jurisdictions where American copyright enforcement was limited. Ossessione is now considered a foundational work of Italian neorealism, a film whose visual seriousness and moral intelligence made MGM's subsequent version look, to certain critics, like the lesser of three. Visconti's film is longer, bleaker, and more explicitly attentive to the class dynamics that make Cain's novel function as social commentary rather than mere crime fiction. MGM held the original novel's rights, spent 12 years doing nothing with them, and was beaten to the story's meaning by an Italian director who didn't have permission to make it. The 1946 American version is the authorized adaptation. It is not, in the judgment of most serious critics who have seen all three, the definitive one. This is exactly why the film's reputation has always carried a slightly defensive quality, as though it knows it was not the first to tell this story well and is making the case for its own necessity against the evidence. The role of Frank Chambers was offered to Joel McCrea, who turned it down. Gregory Peck was considered. John Garfield, under contract to Warner Brothers, was borrowed at MGM's expense, a transaction that required interstudio negotiation and a contractual loan arrangement, whose terms are reflected in the fact that Garfield is billed below Turner on the poster, despite carrying half the film's dramatic weight. At the last minute, Garfield nearly lost the role entirely. Toward the end of World War II, he was drafted. Director Tay Garnett seriously considered replacing him with MGM contract player Cameron Mitchell. Garfield was ruled 4F, exempt from service on medical grounds, specifically his age and a pre-existing heart condition, and returned to the production. Garnett was subsequently alarmed to discover Garfield playing vigorous handball within days of receiving his exemption, and asked him to restrain himself until filming was completed. The heart condition that saved Garfield from the draft in 1945 was the same physiological weakness that would kill him 7 years later. The Army's rejection letter was the first document in the medical biography that ended at 39. But the real problem was not what the heart condition cost Garfield in the long run. It was what the production cost him in the short one. Tay Garnett was a recovering alcoholic. His sobriety was functional, professionally maintained, and sufficient for his career at the time of The Postman Always Rings Twice, a career that included China Seas and Seven Sinners and a reputation for atmospheric direction that made him MGM's choice for this particular film. What ended his sobriety was fog. For the seaside love scenes, Garnett took the cast and crew to Laguna Beach. Fog made shooting impossible for days. They moved to San Clemente. Fog followed. They returned to Laguna Beach. The fog had lifted, then it returned. The protracted delays, the idle days, the accumulating professional frustration of a production waiting on California coastal weather, the strain sent Garnett back to the bottle. He retreated to his hotel room. He would not come out. MGM began circulating rumors that Garnett was about to be replaced. Turner and Garfield, understanding that a director's removal mid-shoot meant chaos for everyone, went to see him themselves. Garfield's appeal failed. Turner's succeeded. She got the director out of his hotel room and back to Los Angeles for treatment. When the fog finally lifted at Laguna Beach, Garnett returned. The film resumed. This is exactly why the beachside sequences, the sequences whose delayed completion nearly destroyed the production, are the film's most visually accomplished passages. Garnett came back sober. The fog had cleared and the camera had all the time it needed. The on-set sexual tension between Turner and Garfield was visible to the entire cast and crew from their first morning together. Documented in Larry Swindell's biography of Garfield. On their first day, he called out to her, "Hey Lana, how's about a little quickie?" And she replied, "You bastard." They had a brief affair, documented by Vincent Sherman, a director and friend of Garfield's, who described Turner as the only co-star Garfield ever became genuinely romantically involved with during production. There had been sparks since the first day of shooting, and the weeks of fog delayed filming at Laguna Beach created the conditions. Enforced proximity, professional frustration, the particular intimacy of waiting together for something that wouldn't come. They shared one night on the beach under a full moon. That was all there was. The following day, they both understood that whatever existed between them on screen had no physical analog off it. They remained close friends. The affair was over before the fog lifted. What survived was the performance, and James M. Cain, who saw it and understood what Turner had managed to put on screen that no other actress the production had considered could have produced. But the real problem was not what happened between Turner and Garfield during production, it was what was happening to Garfield's body during every take. John Garfield's 4F exemption from military service was granted on the grounds of a pre-existing heart condition, damage that biographers have traced to a bout of rheumatic fever contracted years earlier. This physiological fact is not a footnote. It is the key to the entire biographical narrative that follows The Postman Always Rings Twice. The man whose performance in that film generated early Oscar predictions, whose Frank Chambers carries the weight of working-class desire and institutional entrapment with a physical intensity that still registers across 8 decades, was generating that intensity from a body already structurally compromised. His heart had been damaged before the camera rolled. The exertion of the handball court after his 4F exemption was not recklessness. It was a man who had been told he was medically unsuitable for combat, choosing to live in the body he had, rather than the body the Army had decided was too fragile to risk. By 1952, that body would be found at 39 years old in a friend's apartment in New York City, dead of coronary thrombosis. The heart that saved him from the draft killed him 6 years later. This is exactly why The Postman Always Rings Twice, read against Garfield's biography, carries a quality his other films do not. The specific register of physical urgency that belongs to a man playing passion on screen while his own body is running a countdown nobody in the room can hear. John Garfield appeared before the House Un-American Activities Committee on April 23, 1951. He was 37 years old. Internationally famous, the star of The Postman Always Rings Twice and Body and Soul and Force of Evil. He denied Communist Party membership and refused to name names, refused to identify the friends, colleagues, and associates from his group theater years who might have held the political affiliations HUAC was hunting. The refusal destroyed his film career within months. By 1952, no Hollywood studio would hire him. The man who had been predicted to receive an Academy Award nomination for The Postman Always Rings Twice was playing Broadway revivals to keep working. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had compiled a 1,000-page file on him. They had found no evidence that he had ever been a Communist Party member. They knew this. And Federal Bureau of Investigation memo dated June 18, 1951, confirmed internally that available informants had not definitely shown actual Communist Party membership on Garfield's part. They had nothing. They continued anyway. The government then offered him a way out. In May 1952, the Federal Bureau of Investigation presented Garfield with a dossier on his wife Roberta, her expired Communist Party membership card, canceled checks to party-affiliated events, and told him that signing a statement confirming his wife's communist associations would clear his name. Garfield responded with profanity and left the meeting. He died 13 days later. The morning he was scheduled to take a train to Washington for a further HUAC appearance, he suffered a fatal heart attack in the apartment of a former showgirl named Iris Whitney. He was 39. On the day of his death, his friend Clifford Odets confirmed in his own HUAC testimony what the committee had known for a year. Garfield had never been a communist. The investigation was officially closed. He was cleared. He did not live to hear it. His funeral drew crowds that New York had not seen since the death of Rudolph Valentino. More than 10,000 people crowded the streets outside. The HUAC had destroyed a man its own records showed was innocent, broken his marriage, ended his career, and failed to outlast his integrity. John Garfield, born Jacob Garfinkel on Rivington Street, Lower East Side, was the fourth actor to die after subjection to HUAC investigation. The others were Mady Christians at 59, J. Edward Bromberg at 47, and Canada Lee at 45. His estate, valued at more than $100,000, was left entirely to his wife. Shortly after his death, the HUAC closed its investigation and left him in the clear. A clearance that arrived too late to do anything except confirm the cost of the preceding year. Writer-director Abraham Polanski, who worked with Garfield on 2 films, said, "He defended his street boys' honor and they killed him for it." MGM's publicity department was not satisfied with the precautions the White Wardrobe had already taken to soften the film's sexual reputation. They arranged to have Turner photographed on set with her 2-year-old daughter, Cheryl Crane. The implication being that a devoted mother playing Cora Smith could not really be Cora Smith, that the actress's virtue was insurance against the character's depravity. MGM then had Turner bring Cheryl to the film's New York City premiere. The strategy worked as publicity. What it could not have predicted was what the child on set would eventually become. In April 1958, 14-year-old Cheryl Crane stabbed Johnny Stompanato, Turner's controlling, violent boyfriend, with a kitchen knife during a confrontation at their home. The death was ruled justifiable homicide. Cheryl had intervened to protect her mother from a man who was threatening to disfigure or kill her. Stompanato was a man with connections to organized crime, a man who had been carrying a gun in Turner's house for months. The child MGM photographed in 1946 as evidence of her mother's respectability killed a man in 1958 to save her mother's life. No publicity strategy accommodates that sequel, but the real problem was not what came after the film's release, it was what one critic said at the time of it. James Agee, one of the finest film critics the 20th century produced, a man whose prose could be as exacting as his judgments were unforgiving, published a review of The Postman Always Rings Twice, that is, in the precise assessment of a man who respected the material and found the film's response to it inadequate. One of the more devastating critical verdicts of the period. Agee wrote that the film was mainly a terrible misfortune from start to finish, that it looked to have been made in a depth of seriousness incompatible with the material, complicated by a paralysis of fear of the front office, and that it represented what can happen, especially in Hollywood, if you are forced to try both to eat your cake and have it, and don't realize that it is, after all, only good pumpernickel. The image of pumpernickel is the review's permanent contribution to the film's critical conversation. The suggestion that Cain's novel was substantial bread, and that MGM had produced something that tried to be both cake and bread and was neither. Pauline Kael found it entertaining, though overlong. Bosley Crowther at the New York Times was broadly approving. The most serious critic of the period considered it a significant artistic failure. The film that James Agee found primarily a misfortune holds a 95% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes. It is a permanent fixture on every serious canonical list of essential American film noir. The BFI's canonical survey of the genre positions it alongside Double Indemnity and Out of the Past as foundational texts. Turner's performance, which MGM's own publicity department treated as a liability requiring management by proximity to a toddler, is now universally acknowledged as her finest screen work, a judgment that Turner herself endorsed in 1952 when she identified Cora Smith as her favorite role for the Saturday Evening Post. James M. Cain pressed a leather-bound first edition of his novel into her hands with the inscription, "For my dear Lana, thank you for giving a performance that was even finer than I expected." Cain was the author. He had known what the performance needed to be. He had not expected her to find it. She found it. The novel he presented her was his acknowledgement that she had exceeded his imagination. The film that survived 12 years of studio reluctance, production code negotiation, a director's relapse, a male lead whose heart was structurally compromised, and a studio head who hated every frame of it earned $5 million worldwide, and a profit of $1,600,000 for a studio that deserved neither the success nor the credit for it. The male lead who made it was dead at 39. The government that killed him found nothing. The director who filmed it ended his MGM career the following year, refusing to renew his contract after years of corporate interference in his work. The actress who wore the white clothes was photographed with a child who would grow up to use a kitchen knife to keep a violent man from killing her. The censor who approved the white wardrobe died, never having understood what it was advertising. Louis B. Mayer was removed from the head of MGM in 1951, the same year HUAC called Garfield to testify. He did not live to see Garfield cleared. The question, "The Postman Always Rings Twice," leaves buried in its closing frames, in the irony of its title, which Cain never fully explained, and the film never attempts to, is this. If a film about two people destroyed by desire, complicity, and the institutional machinery of justice was itself produced by an institution that despised it, censored by an office that couldn't read what it was approving, and built around a man the government was already preparing to destroy, does the film's fatalism feel earned or designed? And if the answer is both, if the doom that overtakes Frank and Cora was both the story's invention and the biography of its cast, what does that tell you about the line between the films Hollywood makes and the lives Hollywood consumes in order to make them? Leave that in the comments. The postman rang twice. The second time, nobody answered. If this investigation changed how you see The Postman Always Rings Twice, leave a like, because there are 1,000 films built on consumed lives that deserve the same forensic attention, and the algorithm needs to know this kind of digging matters.